So I'm just adding this into the beginning of the video. I just finished filming everything and recording it. I accidentally brought up one case, which was technically another. You should just know that I was speaking to the circumstances of a case here, which was technically about Delphi as v Estonia. Pretty much you have to know, if I'm bringing up a case in the video where I'm saying that a person had anonymously released an article within a website which was found guilty for its actions, but it's not Delphi as v Estonia, then no, it's Delphi as v Estonia, okay? I hope this discretion will do. If people get upset enough, I'll delete this whole video and I'll redo. But I'm very exhausted and I hope you guys can forgive me. Thank you. Article 10, freedom of speech and expression. So we're getting close to the end. Article 11 won't be as exhaustive, but it's good to know already now that whenever you speak of Article 11, freedom to demonstrate and associate, you always have to start off with Article 10 because it's originally a form of speech. Moving on, for Swedish viewers, do not apply logic of TF and ECHR for understanding this article. Please, please, please don't. It's going to mess up your mind. They're not aligned. Even if Sweden technically has to be part of this ratified convention, TF and ECHR still persists. But you should also know that there have been discussions beforehand, both within the EU and the ECHR, where Sweden has a special clause for their own laws. This is like a margin appreciation thing for Sweden's weirdness within this question. But to anyone wondering what that is, non-Swedish viewers, Sweden has a exclusivity clause within one of their constitutional bodies of text, specifically two bodies of texts, where they pretty much, if any of the things within those two bodies of texts are applicable, which usually starts off with pressing text, but you can also have the case of digital spreading of information or digital spreading of speech within certain steps being made. For instance, proof of publication, chain which leads back to someone responsible, but it's good to know that this responsibility usually doesn't go back to the person who maybe, let's say, wrote an article. In Sweden, with TF and ECHR, it works very much differently, where, compared to ECHR or ECMR, where usually the responsibility can go to the person who's said something. In the case of TF and ECHR, you're protected if you follow these steps which activate the exclusive clause or exclusivity clause. If you are confused, that probably means I explained it right, because it is confusing. So don't think about it. But what I just explained that for anyone who was curious, but also to the Swedes watching. This is not going to sound like TF and ECHR, because it's probably going to be better. You guys are going to like this more. Also, I'm pretty sure Article 10 of the Statute of EU or EU-stadgan, it's also Article 10 for freedom of speech. Just a funny fact. Ideas versus information. Lingens and Oberschlick cases. So it just goes into the question of, is the speech informative or is it an idea? So you could also say ideological then, no? And that sort of changes how you approach something. If something is informational, it means that it's sort of a right for the person to tell this, that other people get to hear about it, right? But then you come into cases of where is the information about someone else? If so, how did this information come to be, and so on? It becomes complex. And then we have ideas. It comes down to, like, are these ideas damaging? Are these ideas racist, for instance, homophobic, sexist, and so on? But there has to be a differentiative stance on these two different things when it comes to Article 10. Now, Article does not necessarily, as a presumption, include the right to information. However, it does or can in the case of judicially blocking information from, for instance, journalists. So it sort of goes into those questions through Article 10. And then the access of information possibly infringing someone's right to speech. See below Ian's list of questions courts usually ask. So the first question, the purpose of the request of disclosure. 2, the nature of the information sought. 3, the role of the applicant. And 4, was the information ready and available? So it just goes back to the idea of information versus ideas, right? This has to be a typical case of information. And just asking yourself with question 3, the role of the applicant, is this person the one in question concerning the information? Are they personally affected? Even if they aren't, could they still argue that someone is being affected enough for them to be an applicant? I don't know. And then when you have ideas, it just pretty much goes into consequentialism, no? And then you can bring in Kant and, the ideas of intention. Are these ideas intended to be discriminatory? Are they just parts of ideas? For instance, when you have freedom of speech within religion, it makes things a lot more okay. Because that could be more informational, no? Because it's an information about your religion. For instance, Christianity and the Bible. And the Bible speaking of heresy, of homosexuality. However, I'm pretty sure there are bodies of religious text which, for instance, allow slavery. It allows penalties of death. It allows discrimination against women. And I am pretty sure these ideas are not allowed within religious context. So do not think that this is an absolute thing. It's just a case of, for instance, the LGBTQ community generally don't receive the correct amount of protection. They can be spoken of in very horrific ways, as I will show later on in this video. And the court says it's fine within the margin of appreciation because it's within a religious context. Now, it has found that outside of religion, it's not okay. But to me, that's kind of ridiculous because you could have probably found them not to be able to do that if a religion, for instance, said kill your neighbor over something they did. Because I'm pretty sure the Bible is obsessed with thy neighbor. And they've spoken of heresy from neighbors, which could lead to the right to take away that person or that heretic's rights. And I'm pretty sure if I went around and said to people you should kill someone because of what the Bible says, the court will say no. But if I said that gay people are a cancer on society because the Bible says so, that's actually cool. Yeah, moving on. So an example of information. Magyar Helsinki, blah, 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 versus Hungary. Information about lawyers was sought from an NGO with a watchdog function, and the court had to make a proportionality assessment between the right of the lawyer's interests to privacy, and the court had to also take into consideration the public interest. Now, public interest won in this case. However, the case still has a precedent for a requirement of assessing the question at hand and thereby making future investigations possible, which could lead to a total protection of someone's right to speech by infringing on others' speech. In this case, the speech of NGO via private speech, or rather information. Now, that was a buttload of complicated words. It just comes down to the idea of where if a lawyer is compromised, it does start off with their right to privacy, but it also infringes on their ability to have a freedom of speech. Because if they are aware of the fact that an NGO could find their information, that might limit them. Now, in the end, this wasn't an absolute right. The public interest won. Especially because the NGO, as a function of being watchdogs, needed to persist. But yeah, this is a thing that's going to be coming up in this video for several times. The idea of if you put in the wrong type of precedents through courts, préjudicat, you might end up creating a chilling effect where people are scared to say certain things or do certain things because they know it could later be punishable through unprotected processes. In this case, you have the lawyers being, I don't feel as open to saying whatever I need within these technically disclosed contexts because an NGO could come in and take away my right to being private. So yeah, moving on. It's just good to know with that case as well. I know I was confused when I read it because it felt like it was saying that both parties had a right, and it technically did. It's just that at the end, the convention didn't find that the margin of appreciation was enough to say that that Hungary could totally block the NGO. And then moving on, Article 10.1, last sentence, a state cannot monopolize broadcasting. It's a bit of a dated rule, but it's still important. These are, however, requirements for content of broadcast, which need to be explainable to a court. Meaning, yeah, they can't broadcast anything. Okay, that's pretty much what I was trying to say there. I might have put in a bit inside of a bit of a confusing sequence. It probably should be like this. Okay. Oh. Yeah. Did I just accidentally? Yeah. Okay. Hold up, guys. Oh yeah. Okay. So, moving on. Article 10 can be placed against another right, very often Article 8. So, let's start off. Google v. Spain. I brought this up in a previous video. Google v. Spain is Article 10 being brought up by Google as their right by being a judicial person, and versus a man who said that he didn't want his information to be saved from an auction, which gave away his private information. And the case ended up with Spain's Supreme Court saying that Google couldn't do that, but Google brought it up to the convention because they were like, no, we have a right because we're a judicial person and we want to have a freedom of speech, which in my opinion, as a person now, not as someone trying to teach out law, I'm saying this as an individual, that is ridiculous in my opinion. And it does make me upset to know that Google can get away with this. But I know that this happened before Google even became a big thing. So it's not their fault, but it's still their benefit. Although I'm happy that they didn't win that case. That would have been crazy. However, they did find through assessment of proportionality and setting down precedents. If this man had brought it up like a few months after the auction, Google could have argued that they could keep the information public because there might be relevance for those involved within the auction to find information attractively. But 2 to 3 years, which was, I think, the amount of time that had passed when this man brought it to court, was enough to say Google doesn't have a reason to do this. At Times Newspaper Ltd v UK. Okay, this is like... This is one of the stupidest cases I've ever had to read. Because it is overly complicated. But let me explain it to you guys in a way which is not going to sound like how GPT is going to explain it to you or how probably the case law itself is going to sound. This is a case of a man who was a lawyer. Now, I was unable to find proper information. I was being blocked by GPT. I don't know why, but it was giving information and then it blocked itself. So I'm just going to refrain from speaking to the details of this case, even though I do have it. It pretty much came down to a man who had a newspaper writing something negatively about him, which was through an anonymous source, which was defamatory. I think that was the case. At least he was able to find the court or find the newspaper guilty, but it was guilty of giving out the risk of this man losing future clients due to the information being available through this article. But what wasn't true was that the convention had been broken at that time, particularly. Rather, it just had been a case that was opened up. And they said, now this is where it gets confusing, guys. This was only in the UK, okay? This is one of a kind of a thinking for the UK. This is not how other countries think. But pretty much what the UK was able to decide was that this lawyer can say that anytime that a person enters this article, meaning if the newspaper decides to keep the article open, which they were allowed to do legally, they are under risk of being blamed for breaking the convention in the future if this man should be prohibited from finding proper jobs or work by the fact that the article still exists. So that means that the newspaper kept the article alive. I think almost a decade passes, and then this man was able to reactivate this case because he was able to say, I wasn't able to get a job because people had gone on and found this information in the article, and therefore the newspaper is guilty. And it worked. That's just the case of the UK, okay? This is called the idea of single... Okay, so it was about that was a multiple publication rule. Okay? Meaning, what does that mean? That sounds weird, no? Multiple publication rule pretty much entails that, legally speaking, okay? Do not think logically. Now I need you to think legally with me, okay? Legally speaking, anytime a person enters this article and is within the context of trying to find information about this lawyer, if they ever enter this article, the newspaper company is held liable to, if the defamation within that article, the information within it, if it actually prohibits this lawyer from getting work, even after the first time it was found to be not okay, they can still be found guilty. Meaning this is actually a retroactive thing, no? And it goes against the idea of someone not having to be found guilty more than once for the same thing. This is then called the multiple publication rule. The reason this is going to confuse you guys later on is because the usual thing that countries follow is the single publication rule. Meaning when something is originally published and then later on legally found guilty, that is the only part which is found liable. And you can't repeat cases regarding that, right? The only way you open it is if you want to look into new aspects. But in the case of Times Newspaper Ltd v the UK, that wasn't the case. Everything was the same. But the initial case law had found that they would abstain from further investigation because nothing further was able to be found. However, they didn't bother with putting a precedent, okay? Instead, they said, we're going to open this for future questioning. So like 8 years later, this guy was like, oh my God, I'm not getting a job. It's probably because of this publication that hasn't been removed. And legally, due to the multiple publication rule, I could win. This is not democratic, or at least not part of the rule of law, which is crazy because it's from the UK. But this is not normal, and it's weird. And it brings opportunities to very non-democratic principles, okay? One of the most important things is that when we look into a case, we do it only once and we make sure that it sets up for future questions. But saying that a case could later on be found to be reopened and hold certain parties guilty, I don't know. It's weird. Also because it sets a precedent which could be used to, in the future, I'm saying this speculatively, but just if we're speculating, you could have a country with the single publication rule actually apply the multiple publication rule in the future, if they so please, because they say, well, there have been circumstances where a court has accepted the necessity of re-entering a case. Now, has this happened? No. In today's climate, would that be possible? Not even close. But tomorrow's still going to arrive, and the day after that, and the day after that. And I don't know what's going to happen in the future, and neither do you, or neither does the court. The only thing we know is that this is actually a part of the case law. The multiple publication rule is still valid. Now, people might ask themselves, why the hell would the newspaper keep their article open? If we're going to think logically, maybe they didn't like this guy and they're like, oh, we really want to keep it open. Or they were like, oh, it's all right. I don't know. I'm not going to go into that. Anyone who wants to read the case law, they should. But I'm personally already aware of the fact that it's overly confusing. So I'm not going to confuse myself further. I know what this case is trying to say. And I don't like it. Anyone who wants to say that I'm misinterpreting it, please do. I might be wrong. But I think this isn't safe, the way that these things work. And I'm questioning the newspaper. Because why aren't they removing this? Why are they letting this stay so that later on the multiple publication rule actually becomes a real precedent? That's really weird. It's really eerie. It's weird. A state shouldn't be able to do this. And the fact that a newspaper is complying with these opportunities is unsound. It doesn't make any sense. That's why a lot of people get confused when they read this case. Because it's so random. Why would they keep it open? Why would they let themselves be found guilty later on? An article which becomes redundant with time, why would you let it stay just for it to later on be provable, right? I mean, the guy could have just set them up. He could have had people say, oh, we know that you could open this case at any time. So we, as the people who are going to hire you, we could just pretend like we looked it up. And then you could go to the court and we could just say that that's the case. And then you are going to make the newspaper be guilty of giving out money. Now, in Ian's book, they say that this is bad because it could have a chilling effect on the newspaper because they're going to be scared to say the same things about the same person later on, or just in the context of saying things about people. But in my opinion, or in my head, I'm thinking, why not just remove it? Like, it's fine. Arbitrations happen within courts that maybe speak to lesser powers being given to newspapers or a company. But that's fine. That's how a society needs to work. I just don't understand why this was still made this way. Why they didn't just say, remove the article. It's weird, and it's overly confusing. And the chilling effect doesn't have any proximity to logic, okay? Because why wouldn't they just delete it? Then the chilling effect is neutralized, no? In the further cases, I'm just giving other examples of where Article 10 and 8 is being placed against each other. So in the example of the newspaper versus the UK, that was the man's Article 8 right? Also, but I think also in part his right to free speech, because he doesn't feel safe to actually speak up if people are giving defamatory information out in newspapers. It's a bit complex, but if you guys are curious, look into that case. I think it would be really nice if the forums in the Reddit forums starts discussing this. And I would like it if you guys scrutinize me. If my ideas become the least productive ones, I would be happy about that. That means that you guys are taking over, and that's better. Swedish examples. A pastor in question of breaking BRB 16.8, 16.8, a prohibition of hateful speech due to having made extremely demeaning remarks about homosexuals in a sermon, calling them a cancer on society. The Supreme Court didn't need to take it to the convention because they used case laws. This goes back to what I explained in earlier videos, where case laws can be used arbitrarily. The Swedish state didn't have to do this, okay? They were within their margin of rights. I'm sorry, this is just my intuition, but Sweden would probably be able to stop this pastor from doing this, and still the convention wouldn't have even at least a obvious reason to say that they broke the convention. The margin of appreciation speaks to this being true. Saying that the case law made it impossible for the Swedish court to not do what they did, that it forced the Swedish Supreme Court to do what they did, that's not true. That totally contradicts the concept of margin of appreciation. So if the Supreme Court of Sweden is trying to say that this was the convention, then I say, no, this was you guys. You guys just chose to use case laws from other nations because you decided to say that we as a nation agree with this principle. But it's not an absolute thing. You don't have to say that there was no other way. I don't know if the Supreme Court did argue this. I'm just explaining to you guys. You shouldn't assume that this pastor was able to say these things just because of the convention. This was also Sweden making a case for themselves. And then Veideland and others v. Sweden is pretty much the same case without the religious context, making it not okay. Nothing much more to that fact. Now, moving on. Regarding the internet, we've already been speaking of it a little bit. Now, before it was the Times Newspaper Ltd UK. It does have a few things regarding the internet indirectly because it's about, finding people's information and stuff, meaning the article was available online. But anyways, there are certain circumstances from each development of quote-unquote speech placed into consideration. The first being original speech through internet, which is thereby two factors, okay? Now remember, this whole topic is about the internet, okay? So when I say speech, I'm implying speech within the internet. So there is the publisher and the host of the publisher, meaning the website. Now these two can be combined in some examples. For instance, the publisher can be directly connected to the website because it's like a newspaper, meaning they're hired by them. But then you have other cases where someone is posting stuff, right? And then that can get a bit complex because how do you keep up with responsibilities when a bunch of people are spreading a bunch of things? you can't really control that, and it can become very easily totalitarian, at least within the websites. That's like the way Elon Musk was able to propagate X into something liberal, because he explained that the freedom of speech is more important than the idea of restricting certain ideas that can be hurtful, thereby saturating the Twitter forum to the point of being like one of the worst places you could leave your mind to the mercy of. I'm being serious. If you're on X, please be careful. Like, genuinely be careful. There is no regulation in that site. And I say that being genuinely worried for anyone who uses X. But that's just me. Maybe people are getting mad now saying, oh, the X is fine. I'm not saying the people within X aren't fine. I'm saying the people who own X aren't fine. They're not being regulated, and they're certainly not regulating themselves to the point of people at least feeling safe with how they present themselves. Unfortunately, Elon Musk hasn't done that. And yeah, here I write again, likely one of the most linguistically complex cases of all time in the West, in my opinion. I will not bother writing it down. Listen to my explanation, and listen more than once to my explanation if needed. If it was confusing, then listen to it again, or look it up on GPT with me. And don't like, if you're confused while the GPT or any AI is explaining it to you, just keep on asking, okay? Keep on looking for different ways of it explaining it to you. Because for some reason, in my case, it was skipping through very essential details and using the terms such as the chilling effect as the only explanation. It took me 6 messages to get the explanation of a sentence-long reasoning, okay? And yeah, this case does have huge implications. You need to understand it even if it is unnecessarily complex. And if people disagree, then you need to look into the rule of law and its own principles against despotism. It should be a single publication rule, but it isn't. Yeah, so like I said, I've been jumping around a lot. I'm sorry, guys. But yeah, so you have the first step of the factor of the publisher and the host of the publish. And then you have speech becomes a means of spreading ideas, and then the original speech from publisher has led to a consequential event which infringes on rights. This is just a normal way of looking at how the cases of internet sort of become relevant. In the case of, for instance, Google v. Spain, then you had the publication also being the publisher. So Google was held responsible for having left open the information of this guy after his selling his house in the auction. Now, in this case, the people who published this information weren't responsible. Google, as the hosts of the publishing, was held responsible due to their search engines. But as you can see with the case of LTD New York, it could also be the case of a website which is found through search engines that are held responsible. It totally depends, right? Moving on, these steps are determined by the single publication rule, meaning it always goes back to the factor of the publisher, but also the factor of the published thing in itself only being looked at as a singular event. This goes against LTD UK, okay? Because there, the publication rule is constant. Anytime someone reads the text about that lawyer, they can legally become part of a case where they felt uncomfortable with hiring this lawyer, and thereby this lawyer didn't get his job, and from that point on, it becomes a multiple publication rule. If it were a single publication rule, then in 2000, or I think it was 2001, the case would have come up with the lawyer, precedents would have been set, the article would have been deleted, and then no one would have read it. And even if it were to stay online, which would be weird because that would mean that it didn't break the law, but if it did stay online, you'd still have the single publication rule, where you'd say you have to go back to that case unless you have something new to add on to what this publication can have for consequences. It doesn't matter. You can't rehash things. That's the single publication rule, but also goes into the rule of non-retroactive action. As you can see, it's very confusing, no? But in the case of Delphi versus Estonia, Estonia won a case where they'd forced a website to pay a small sum fine for releasing a defamatory remark made by an anonymous person. Oh my god, no! I explained the Times Newspaper Ltd UK incorrectly. I said it was about what was actually Delphi as v Estonia. Yeah, I'm just gonna have to edit that away later. But if my editing is weird, you'll know why by watching by this point. Oh god, that's annoying. But yeah, anyways, the case of this case versus Estonia, it was a bit controversial because it goes back to the idea of like how do you hold a website responsible for something that someone else has posted. But there is still a case where it can be, doable. A state can still give out a fine. And it went back to the single publication rule where the convention said Estonia can do this because they're not going to be able to do it again. And it sets up an important precedent. So it protects people in the future. It does give out retribution to those that broke the case, but it also was proportional. Delphi didn't have to pay for their own existence or future publications. They just had to pay a fine, and they had to understand that these things are not they're not okay. So it's fine. It's proportional, right? Times Newspaper Ltd UK is not that proportional. It's everywhere and nowhere. Anyways, I'm sorry if this video was a bit confusing. I hope that the prompt combined with the transcripts can help you guys navigate better. And I hope that whatever AI model you're using doesn't go easy on me. I hope that it corrects me exhaustively, as any system should when looking at my comments on law, because anyone speaking on law should be scrutinized. Thank you, and until next time.